All right, we're looking at the Kennedy administration and President Kennedy getting elected to the 1960 election, and just who was John Kennedy and what was the scenario that he was able to um, put forth and to win the election. So in 1960, the Republicans had controlled the White House for the previous 8 years. The loss of China, the fear of spread of communism in our country, um, the Korean War had warred on the American public, and they made the Democrats pay with losses both of Congress and of the White House. But in 1960, you'd had a president in Dwight D. Eisenhower who had been a very middle of the road, very calm force in a very traumatic time period. And the Democrats, as most good political strategies are, when everybody's zigging, you zag. Case in point, President Trump in the last election, when nobody thought you'd run a campaign the way he did, and he won. So all the detractors that say he's terrible and all those things, he still won. President Kennedy is going to be in many ways somewhat like Mr. Trump in that he is a complete opposite of what the American public had seen and been around. He is a very young, he's 42 years old. He's the youngest president ever to win the office. He's the first Catholic, only Catholic to ever get elected. That was a huge, monumental feat. And he's going to represent the Democratic Party. And he's going to go up against the vice president of the United States in Richard Nixon, a senator from California who had a pretty distinguished long record. And so it looked like it was going to be a pretty handily easy win for the Republicans. The 1960 election, as I mentioned, is between Vice President Richard Nixon, who the public knows, who the country knows, and Senator John Kennedy, who was very charismatic, great in front of the public, great in front of the camera. He's a World War II veteran, but he has very little experience. Okay. The 1960 election will be somewhat like President Obama and his election. It's the first time that the country had ever seen email. And President Trump was the first time the country could ever have seen Twitter. And those were absolutely pivotal in both of those guys as candidates to becoming president. President Obama could reach the masses, and the Republican Party was behind the curve, and the Democratic Party and President Obama was able to get his message out on a relatively inexpensive menu with email. And President Trump, who was, I think safe to say, probably not liked by the media, is not their cup of tea. He's able to bypass the media by using Twitter and get his message out directly to the people and not be stymied. Well, Mr. Kennedy did the same thing. He's the first candidate, him and President Nixon were the first two to ever debate on a national stage in front of the television. And it's a unique setting that they have where the entire nation is going to look at both candidates. Mr. Nixon, who had been very, very sick, had been in the hospital, he had appendicitis, was just getting over that. And I don't know what he was thinking, but he had some bad advice, and he didn't really take the preparation seriously as far as how you were going to come off on camera. And so he didn't look good when he was talking. He never knew what camera was on him, whereas Kennedy paid very close attention to what the TV people were saying, and how to cue yourself up. And he looked very relaxed. And he took questions and looked very, very good. And so a candidate that was looking to come off as a very inexperienced um, candidate who was, again, there was a lot of hands off because of being the first Catholic. And what that meant was Catholicism, and what people feared, a Protestant nation, feared that, was Mr. Kennedy going to serve the Constitution of the United States, or was he going to serve the Pope, who was the leader of the Catholic Church? And Kennedy really handles himself well when answering those questions. He comes across very likable. And Mr. Nixon, in the interview and on the debate, is sweating, and he just doesn't look comfortable, and he kind of looks, like he's shifty and not trustworthy. And that was a big deciding factor for a lot of people. Kennedy will go away winning the election by less than 100,000 votes, and that's one of the slimmest margins of victory ever. When President Kennedy gets elected, he proposes a agenda plan, and much like President Obama with Affordable Care Act, or President Bush and the No Child Left Behind, you got to have a cool acronym. You got to have something to name your agenda. And his was going to be the New Frontier. And the New Frontier was an aggressive agenda to push for a stronger defense. We're facing communism. That's a really, really good thing to say to the American public, is that we're big on defense and protecting of the American people. Next, he was proposing a huge tax cut to stimulate the economy. Next, he was proposing health care and giving health care to elderly. That's called Medicare. And he's going to introduce that program. And we did not have Medicare at this point in time. So a lot of elderly people, as they retire, don't have any health care, and they can't take care of themselves. And the hospitals can't afford it. And they would, you weren't taken care of. You died. Next, he talked about rebuilding the urban areas, the downtowns of major metropolitan areas like New York and that. And then he wanted to improve education. He wanted to invest into education. He also vows vehemently to fight against communism. And he talks about doing this wherever or whenever it comes up. Mr. Kennedy will be the first to send advisors to Vietnam. So in 1961, I believe, he sends advisors to Vietnam, to South Vietnam, to start advising them on what to do with the communists in North Vietnam. He's going to have a plan to go into South America to combat the communists, the Soviet Union in Cuba, with what's called the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps is a civil group that's going to go in and educate and teach primarily Latin America how to have clean water, build homes, build hospitals, and it's going to combat the threat of communism with a better life. A very successful program. And then after we have the Soviets go out into outer space with Sputnik, and that Kennedy is going to propose, as we're behind in the space race, that we're going to go to the moon. The problem that Mr. Kennedy runs into, though, is Mr. Kennedy is going to run into a stiff challenge from the Republicans. Though he won the election, he does not control Congress. The Democrats don't control Congress. So see if you can understand what I'm saying here. Mr. Obama in 2008 wins a mandate. He won both the White House, or the Democrats, I should say, won the White House, and then they control both houses of Congress. So that's a mandate from the American public saying, all right, Democrats, we're going to give you 2 years until the next off-year election, and you guys do whatever you want. And really, when a party has a mandate like that, you're allowed to dictate your policy back to the other party. President Trump in 2016 wins a narrow very narrow victory, and he enjoys the opportunity to win the House of Representatives and the Senate. So he had a mandate from the American public. And when you get that, there's very little that the other party can do. They can obstruct you. They can try to slow you down with throwing roadblocks in your way. But if your party says, "Hey, listen, we want to have the American public eat toasted cheese sandwiches on Thursday," unless it's a direct violation of the Constitution, there's very little the other party can do, because you control the votes and you can pass that legislation, that idea in Congress, and the president can vote for it. If you don't control Congress, if you are in the minority, your party's in the minority, really you're left with saying, my domestic agenda is going to be hampered because I'm going to get very few of my policies passed through. Now, believe it or not, at one point in time, our political system worked a little bit more cooperatively together. So even though he doesn't have a mandate and he's going to run stiff opposition against him in the Republicans, he's going to be able to get some of his programs through. The Republicans are going to buy into some of his ideas. President Kennedy is a very polarizing figure, as I've mentioned to you. We've already done the assassination of President Kennedy. We kind of did this in backwards order, but President Kennedy has a lot of detractors. There is a bunch of people in our country that do not want to push for the agenda of more money being spent by the federal government. Believe it or not, in 1960, there's a lot of people that are saying the federal government's too big and they're spending too much money. Ha! That's almost laughable when you think about what we're doing today. But at that time, that was the argument. And I'm going to say this to you again, and I've said it to you a number of times. The more things change, the more things stay the same. So the argument is that the Republicans are going to throw out is the government's getting too big, and the Democrats want the government to control everything, and the Democrats always say the Republicans don't care, and they're just only out for the rich people, and they're an elitist party. It's the same rhetoric that you've heard from the parties for a long, long time. So President Kennedy and getting his agenda passed, and what he looked to do is something that he actually will take on civil rights, and start to move towards civil rights and bettering relationships and doing away with some of the acts of discrimination. So did Eisenhower in the second term. But Kennedy's going to start moving that direction. But then tragically, we're going to see President Kennedy be taken out and pass with his assassination in November of 1963. And so let's stop there, and we'll pick up on our next lecture after this, as we've already done the Kennedy assassination and that.